And but the interesting data scientists I found, or the interesting people in general, are just those who I think who take a very kind of left field approach to knowledge, and they read outside of the circle that they're supposed to be in. And I think that's awesome, right? Because I think it just makes you, after a while, knowledge compounds on itself, and you come up with very unexpected ideas and approaches, and who knows what that turns into. But I tend to appreciate that as well.
This episode of Ken's Nearest Neighbors is powered by Z by HP, HP's high compute, workstation grade line of products and solutions. Today, I had the pleasure of interviewing Joe Reis. Joe is a recovering data scientist and the CEO of Ternary Data. He's a business-minded data nerd who's worked in the data industry for over 20 years, with responsibilities ranging from statistical modeling, forecasting, machine learning, data engineering, data architecture, and almost everything else in between. He's the host of the popular data show and podcast, The Monday Morning Data Chat. He stays busy because he also hosts the Data Nerd Herd and runs several popular meetups, including the Utah Data Engineering Meetup and SLC Python. Joe also teaches at the University of Utah and is the co-author of the upcoming O'Reilly book, The Fundamentals of Data Engineering. When he's not busy running a company, teaching, creating content, doing all these crazy things, Joe often finds himself rock climbing or trail running in the mountains around Salt Lake City. In this episode, Joe talks about how the data domain has changed over the last 20 years. You'll also learn why he considers himself a recovering data scientist. I hope you enjoy the episode. Joe Reis, thank you for coming into the Ken's Nearest Neighbors podcast today. We've rolled in similar circles for quite some time.
Yep.
And I'm really happy we could pull this together and get you in here to tell your story. I mean, you've been in this
space.
For having
me on.
No problem. You've been in this space and had quite a journey, and you've seen it evolve over time. And I think your perspective, especially on that, could be really interesting to people who are just getting into it.
Sure.
We might see where it's going, but it's really important to understand where it's come from, to see how the things that we do can drive the future of data science, data engineering, whatever that might be.
Right. Yeah, it's been an interesting journey for sure. I think data, when I got into it back in the early 2000s, it was certainly not the sexy career that it is now. I would say it was the furthest thing from it. I always joke that it's kind of like, if you ever watch Office Space, that old movie from the 90s. Yeah, it's like,
of course.
Like data people were kind of like Milton, the guy with like the red stapler that was like shuttled off the basement of the office. I think he was living there without pay or something. So that's kind of what I felt like data people were back in the day for the most part. So it's certainly a far cry from. It's changed a bit, yeah. Now it's like a hot career and everyone wants to get into it. But that's cool. That's really cool to see. But the other things too, it's interesting, like the career progressions. I would say back then, like I did my degree in math, and your options were really be an actuary or maybe go work for the government, or be an analyst, right? And so that's kind of where I got my start, was working as an analyst out of school, and then I was doing I was about to become an actuary actually, and then I decided not to. But I think those skills translated over for doing a lot of like analysis and also predictive modeling and optimization and stuff. So that was how I cut my teeth. So that was a lot of fun.
Harpreet also started as pursuing the actuarial sciences path, and there's a lot of crossover. The nice thing, data science, we don't have as many certifications and exams to go through, which is a good thing, but also in theory could be a bad thing as well.
Sure.
Something I would love to ask is where you first got exposure to data. Was it like, or you first realized that this was a viable career path for you? Was it this pivotal moment where you saw something incredible happen, or the power of it? Or was it this slow progression from, like going to like pursuing actuarial sciences to going down a further road?
It's a good question. I kind of think back on this, and it wasn't really a specific moment. I would say when I was a kid in the 80s, I grew up in the 80s, and it was like me and my friends were dorking around. We made an inventory tracking system for all of our fireworks and all this other garbage that we had laying around, because I don't know why. I guess it kind of beat playing Pitfall or whatever old games we'd play on there. So, but then I would say around like 92, I got an internet connection. I had been living in Wyoming at the time, which there I mean, they barely had phones there. So, and so I got on the internet, and at the time it wasn't really the internet; it was just bulletin board services and maybe some, I would say like early drafts of the internet. And so, I'd like to think I was, one of the first people, at least of my generation, that was actually online, which was interesting. And so I saw technology really evolve from, all text-based interactions, and data really, being very, very small, and basically inaccessible to kind of beta testing the first web browser, which was Mosaic back in, was it 93 or 94? And then just, watching the whole rise of it. So I've always had an interest in the technology space and, programming, on and off for a long time. And I think with data, I think it's just been a natural kind of thing. Like I'd always been interested in data, even from the early days, looking at statistics of like really weird shit, and stuff like that. So, and like I said, I think just being online early, I think gave me an appreciation for like data growth and just being exposed to like, I think a lot of just really weird ideas that you probably wouldn't have been exposed to if you weren't online, especially that early. So,
what were some of the really weird statistics that you were looking at, or maybe the weirdest that you can think of?
That's a good question. I can't really remember any of them offhand now. So, but it was, but I think it was just kind of lurking in a lot of these forums and stuff back in the day, like gun control statistics and stuff like that. I had like an interesting, I guess bend towards those kind of things early on. I used to debate in high school as well, so I was always interested in like facts and stats and stuff. But yeah, nothing strangely comes to mind, even though I thought they were weird at the time. So, but yeah, it was interesting. I guess the progression into data itself as a career really did start. I mean, I was originally a mechanical engineering student, then switched to math. I felt like it would be a different subject, which it certainly was. And from there, like I said, it kind of took off. So, yeah.
Something that I think is really interesting about the space. I mean, people are like, oh, why wasn't data science around earlier, or why wasn't this field as valued previously? To me, it's really clear from what you just described is that the data wasn't available, 30 years ago, right? The tools were not available 30 years ago. The compute power for us to be able to do a lot of these things, barring like linear regression, wasn't available. And so you have this beautiful convergence of those three forces that I described, as well as like people seeing the value in it, that has made this space boom so much over those last 30 years. And it's incredible to kind of track that progress and realize that we weren't capable of this because of multiple reasons, not just because we didn't want to do it or we didn't see the importance of it.
Well, for sure. Like back in the day, I think right when the web browser came out, I mean, that was the explosion of, that was the start of the internet, basically. You had walled gardens like AOL and stuff, but like, okay, so you look at like what spawned a lot of the web technologies and a lot of the big data technologies. Well, it was the web, right? Hadoop came out of Yahoo, for example, because they stretched the limits of their databases that they had. And so that, but data back in the day was very small, right? To your point. And if you were doing any analytics, I mean, say you were using Excel, for example, that had like a 65,000 row limit at the time.
Big at the time, massive. Now
it's like, well, when they finally got like a million rows in Excel, you're like, holy crap, this is amazing. Like, this is like really big data. But then, obviously your computers were really wimpy back then too. But then, databases were starting to improve. I would say, I'd been involved in projects for like data warehousing and OLAP cubes and all this, fun stuff back in the 2000s. And but I'd say data started, analytics started taking a big turn probably around that time too, because I think web analytics really drove a lot of this, like understanding consumer behavior from a different lens. Suddenly you had access to a lot of aggregated data you just never had before. Like marketing data, for example, I saw that change when I got involved, in my career in sales and marketing analytics. It was like looking at TV spend and radio spend and print spend and all this other stuff. And like the data was compiled like, every few weeks or maybe every week, right? And then you just look at it that way. Now it's, instantaneous and there's so much data. So you can just do a lot more.
Well, it might be a little tangential, but I think the evolution in marketing is really fascinating, and it could be not a precursor, but it is some perspective into what might happen in the future. So like marketing data was one of the best and first use cases for big data. There's a lot of volume of information, and companies that could analyze the data on their marketing spend early had a distinct advantage. Now, I don't know that many companies that are really using marketing analytics and investing in it like they did before, because they've outsourced a lot of this stuff to Facebook or Google or whatever it might be. And they're still paying people to run these systems, but all the powerful machine learning and AI, or the majority of it, is being run by these third-party systems that are owning the pipeline. Mm-hmm. And to me, that's a really interesting evolution to think about, is that, like, where do things go after you've accumulated this knowledge? Like, does it make sense to specialize in it, or to just pass it off if someone else is doing better? And that's like this really interesting like continuous cycle, is like, what's next? There are some industries where you couldn't transition that, but that's something I've noticed uniquely in marketing that I find really interesting.
Yeah, I mean, I was looking the other day. There was like 8,000 marketing tech companies, and probably more by this point. I mean, think about that for a second. That's a field that didn't really exist, back in the day. There was a few companies, but there's been an explosion in a lot of these services that to your point, do sort of abstract and obfuscate a lot of what data scientists may have been doing back in the day. Back in the day, also being as recently as like 5 years ago, right? So things change insanely fast. So I find it pretty fascinating. I don't know where it goes. I think abstraction is sort of the name of the game whether you're talking about data science or data engineering or any other field. Frankly, it's there's just a lot of money in abstracting away things, and so people will do it.
Well, I mean, that is one of the really interesting things about this space, is that some companies, some concepts are going to be like forced abstraction to specialized services, and others, you take finance, for example, they're going to be loading things up way more in-house because of just the nature of the industry. And it's difficult to predict. I mean, those two are probably the easiest to predict, but it's difficult to predict what other industries, what direction they'll go. Changing, good.
Oh, no, good.
Perfect. Changing gears a little bit, I'd love for you to walk me through a little bit of kind of your career path. We left off when you were getting your math degree, and just to understand what that journey has been like for you, and maybe some of the just really pivotal moments that help with your understanding of this career in this domain.
Yeah, I mean, I had a very interesting start, because I started, like I said, as an analyst, and before I knew it, like a few months later, I was directly reporting to the CEO of the company I was working at, and because he wanted somebody he could trust to give him numbers and predictions and so forth. So that was an interesting excursion, really, because it was like getting an MBA really quick too, because I was forced to basically apply my analysis and math skills, and I guess data science skills, to domain problems. So I worked in marketing, oversaw a lot of operations at this company, supply chain as well. So it was, and sales analytics. I kind of got the whole gamut of just everything, 360 view. And it was a very unique thing, especially, at a young age, I think, being responsible for helping make pretty key decisions. I have no idea why this guy was crazy enough to have me in this position, but I guess it worked out. So, but I think that really informed the rest of my career. So I always kind of worked as an applied, I guess, data scientist, so to speak, is what I guess I would be called now. But, data has always been something I've worked in. So, I've worked in e-com, consumer electronics, very early machine learning, automated machine learning startup back in the early 2010s. And that's really where I think that's changed my opinion of data quite a bit. So then I went from being more of an applied user of it to, and a practitioner, I guess, to, understanding, okay, so the engineering aspects of stuff is, I think, the other thing where data science, especially at the time, really needed to level up. And so like machine learning engineering, data engineering weren't really things back then. Nothing was really available back then. You didn't have TensorFlow. You didn't have any of this stuff. You kind of had to invent it all from scratch. And there was, so that was an adventure for sure. I think it gave me an understanding real early, like this machine learning is really hard, actually, in production, not just doing it in a notebook. And so that informed the second act of my career, which was just getting into like data engineering, so, and having worked as a data scientist and a data team lead at various companies and stuff, it kind of just kept reinforcing over and over. Like the hard part was really the engineering, in my opinion. And I guess I like that idea so much. I called myself a recovering data scientist and started a company around it. So, so my company, Ternary Data, now, my latest job, I guess, we're a data engineering consulting firm. So that's all we do.
Well, one of my favorite things to do, and it's not necessarily good form, but I use so many ternary operators when I code in Python, especially for data engineering. Just like you apply it to a data frame and you just throw a ternary in there, and it makes it very easy to manipulate things. Again, probably not the most efficient or useful, but if anyone has watched any tutorial that I've done, I almost certainly have included some ternary operators.
Oh, that's pretty awesome.
So there is, in my mind, like, I wouldn't say a conflict, but they're two different forces at play with a lot of the exploratory data science work and a lot of the data engineering and machine learning like engineering approaches. So it's kind of like in my mind, a creativity versus a systems approach. And I think both are really important. And when you're designing the systems, there's a lot of creativity at play. But if we're looking at data engineering, we want to build something that is consistent and reliable and like it doesn't mess up. When we're doing analysis or making a recommendation, those aren't necessarily front of mind. And
right.
I would really like to, hear you talk about how those things have perhaps become more solidified or less clear, and what that evolution looks like over time, because you were able to see that firsthand and you literally started a company around it.
Mm-hmm. I think it's interesting. I mean, I think the role of a data engineer is really to set the data scientists and data analysts up for success, right? So they can do the exploratory creative work, right? The data scientists and analysts, that is. And so I think that's really how data engineering services, data science and enables them to do their best work. It's not the other way around though, right? Like a data scientist really wouldn't enable a data engineer. Maybe they do actually, I suppose. That's kind of a weird feedback loop, but it's the tooling though, it's directly the data engineer's responsibility to do all this. So I think they can coexist in harmony, and preferably it's like, I kind of see it as maybe if a data scientist is an ice skater or something, then the data engineer is the one who built the the ice rink or whatever, right? So it's that's kind of how I see it. You're really architecting the systems that the practitioners are using. I think allows them to really best express themselves and do their best work. Like the common trope I often hear about data scientists is they spend like 80% of their time cleaning data, getting data, all that not fun stuff that people realize is just the reality of just dealing with data. But really, that should be the data engineer's job, is to get you the data you need so you can spend 100% of your time ideally working on modeling, analysis and so forth.
Yeah, well, I think it's interesting what you said is like not fun stuff. That's all relative. I mean, I'm sure we both know so many people that really enjoy cleaning data and love that process. Yep. And I think it's really important also for people that are getting into this field. Like a lot of people are really uncomfortable with ambiguity. And if you're in a more traditional data science role, there's going to be a tremendous amount of that. You can still have an incredible career in this domain and make a huge impact at a company and find enjoyment in perhaps like a data engineering role, which there is still ambiguity, but there is less of that, I think, almost universally. Same thing with the machine learning engineering role, is that like you're implementing these things, and this is broad strokes. This is obviously case by case is different, but I think that there is a lack of understanding of how different the nature of these roles can be from like a mindset and from a like nature of work and comfort level perspective. And I'm really glad that we can talk about how like opening that up could open up a lot of people's minds. Like, hey, data scientist isn't for me, but I still love data. What can I do within this domain?
Right.
There's probably something that would fit your nature or your interests.
Yeah, there's no shortage of, I think, options, especially nowadays with the data world being very, I think, fluid in a lot of ways. Like, I think there's a standard like data science path that people are told they have to go on. I'm not even sure what that is, but it seems like there is, right? Like I have to know like this roadmap, this flow chart of like all these technologies and all this other stuff. And I'm kind of like, I think it's becoming a lot more nuanced. I would say that the roadmaps back in the day, and even the old Drew Conway Venn diagram of like hacking stats and like domain expertise, I think that a lot of that's kind of being thrown out the window in a lot of ways, depending on the data maturity of the company that you're working in. You might get more fine-grained roles. And to your point, maybe you like data cleaning. I mean, there's people who like cleaning teeth, they become dentists, and there's nothing wrong with that. It's a fine living, and cleaning data it's necessary, and so forth. And so I think it's, you know, there's just a lot of options, right? But everyone, I think what I see is there's sort of this belief that, oh, if I'm a data scientist, I have to be doing machine learning all the time, right? And so when I see what people do early in the careers as a data scientist, they try and throw the machine learning hammer at like every possible nail, whether or not it's a nail or not. So
machine learning is the answer. What's the question?
Bingo, right?
So not a good approach.
Yeah, but it's an approach that I think it's just the enthusiasm, right? Like people want to do this because it's like, this is what I learned to do. Let's get going. Let's do some machine learning. Like this is what I paid the big bucks to put all my time into, right? Like I don't want to be doing the manual labor work. But unfortunately, it's like the Karate Kid when Mr. Miyagi starts teaching all the how to paint a fence and stuff, and you're like, what? This isn't what I signed up for. I want to go kick some ass. I don't want to be like painting fences and washing cars all day. So it's kind of the same thing. But
I love that analogy. It was one of my favorite movies as a kid, just growing up because my dad looks a little bit like Mr. Miyagi.
Oh, it's hilarious. Mr. G.
Very similar stature.
Did you watch Cobra Kai?
I've seen clips and stuff on YouTube. I haven't gotten deep into it yet, though.
I think you'd like it.
Yeah, I will definitely check it out.
It's pretty funny. Yeah.
So something I really want to cover is, so at a high level, something I think is really important. One of the reasons why I create content is to help in an idealistic way, to shape what data science is, so people have a better understanding of what the roles are, what they can expect, and a lot of things along those lines. I think that is one of the really valuable parts of creating a community around this, is that we can together define what these things are and eliminate as much ambiguity as possible. Like obviously these things are going to vary by companies, but if people have a more like a more clear understanding of what they could be seeing going into a role, to me that's really helpful. Something I'd like to understand from you is how communities have evolved in this space over time, and like how you've been involved with those, and where you potentially might see them going. This episode of Ken's Nearest Neighbors is brought to you by Z by HP. HP's high compute, workstation grade line of products and solutions. Z is specifically made for high performance data science solutions, and I personally use the ZBook Studio and the Z4 workstation. I really love that the Z line can come standard with Linux, and they also can be configured with the data science software stack. With the software stack, you can get right into the work of doing data science on day one without the overhead of having to completely reconfigure your new machine. Now back to our show.
Yeah, I mean, I think in the early days, I was in like lots of IRC chats and stuff. If you remember what those are.
I don't. What is IRC?
Internet relay chat. So it used to be like kind of like what Slack is now, but it's like, all text based. And so there are all these kind of things back in the day. And I'd say even old Usenet groups from the 90s and stuff. It was interesting kind of seeing what all the nerds are up to. And so the community's always been there. I'd say tech is one of those cool places where like it had community baked in from day one, just because of the nature of stuff like email and forums and stuff. So, but now you're starting to see it expressed, more online. I think whether it's social media, data and social media is a really funny one. Like that wasn't really a thing. I say when I got into Facebook, I think in, what was that, 2008, 7, thereabouts. Like that data wasn't really a thing back then. You just, post pictures of yourself and but social media has changed data, I think, a lot. I think it's made it a lot more accessible, which I think is cool. Internationally, it's like you can communicate with people everywhere now, and I think that's awesome. Not just in your local area. I mean, I've been doing, locally, I've been doing meetups for years. I think I started our first meetup like 2013 or 2014, this Python meetup. And so, I had a very early exposure to growing local communities. And since then I started a data engineering meetup and help out with a few others. But COVID, I think, really accelerated global communities because local things just died. What that meant, though, is like people like yourself and me, we meet, and it's like now this is the community, right? Like I was actually just talking the other day with some friends, about revitalizing the local tech community, because I feel like even at my meetups, the speakers I get are all from all over the world now. I don't think I've had a local speaker for over a year. So that kind of sucks actually, but so we're looking at ways to do that, but it's just challenging with the pandemic right now, and the kind of the second surge or third surge we're getting ain't helping things. So we're trying to be creative, but I would say that the other aspect of community I find interesting is it's not a zero sum game. So just there's a lot of great data science content producers out there, and data content producers in general, and we're all friends, which I think is awesome. Right. So it's not like, if somebody watches Ken's video, they can't watch my video or anybody else's, Andrew's videos or Kate's videos. It's like everybody, I think, consumes each other's content. And I think, as producers, we're all supportive of each other. The audience, obviously subscribes to a lot of different channels and, and on social media posts, comments and likes and everybody's posts. I think it helps make it, I think it helps make everything stronger in the end. That's what I really like about it. So it's not like like consulting or something where it's very much a zero sum game. Like you either get the contract or you don't, right? And we had to, then it's a competition. Content, I think, is a friendly competition, but it's also, I think, all of us push each other, and the community benefits because it's just to get so many different perspectives and so many and possibly very confused. But I think this just kind of goes with the territory. But because it's like, okay, so you have your data science tips, I may have mine, and it's like they may not jive at all, and so a person's like, I have no idea what to believe. I'm just going to become a plumber and just say screw it. So
or the plumber of data science. I forget what the guy's name is. Andreas, yeah. There
Yeah.
you go.
Exactly.
Well, I think that's I agree with you 100% that the of the additive nature where it's like, hey, if I listen to one thing and I hear something similar from someone else, like I can still get value from both of those two different things. To me, the idea that there is a little bit of dissonance, and for the most part, I think that people generally agree. I mean, the things that people disagree on, perhaps like the order of learning data science skills, those are the types of things that vary by individual quite a bit as well.
Yep.
And so it's like, well, what I really try to encourage is for people to experiment and go down some rabbit holes sometimes, because like you're different, you're fundamentally different based on who you are, based on your experiences, and some messages are going to resonate more with others. But on the flip side, there's this tremendous value in overlapping information in my mind, because if I don't understand it, if I don't understand the same content from one person and another person says it in a way that I understand, they could be saying the exact same thing, but just with like maybe a different spin or a different example. Like a lot of people think they're dumb because they don't understand it, but it might just be that the communication style or whatever it is, it just doesn't jive with you. And that's a cool reinforcing community. I love it when people essentially like remake the same videos that I make, as long as I get accredited, because as long as they're not saying the same things, but using same titles, using same themes, to me that's good. Like I want someone to have a different perspective on those things. What I say isn't gospel, right? Like it should be taken with a grain of salt. And if I'm wrong, like let me know I'm wrong, because I'm going to keep making videos if on the same things if I'm not challenged a little bit or whatever it might be.
Yeah, and it's a cool thing. I mean, everyone, and I think it's a nice thing with knowledge, right? It's never static. It always changes. I mean, the other thing a piece of advice I give people too is just read widely. It's like, I think there's some standard books that everyone reads, and but the interesting data scientists I found, or the interesting people in general, are just those who I think who take a very kind of left field approach to knowledge, and they read outside of the circle that they're supposed to be in. And I think that's awesome, right? Because I think it just makes you, after a while, knowledge compounds on itself, and you come up with very unexpected ideas and approaches, and who knows what that turns into. But I tend to appreciate that as well. So
I agree. Harpreet is the master of reading random books. So we'll give him a little shout out.
Yeah,
I'm trying. I know him and Christina, they read so much. I try to get through a book or like every other week, but sometimes it's easier said than done depending on the content. So another thing I'd like to ask, as you've built these communities, as you've been involved in these communities, what are some of the best ways that other people can get involved in them?
I mean, apart from saying just get involved, I mean, that's not really a helpful answer. I would say definitely volunteer. I mean, even if it's help, like keep conversations going. I would say I see this a lot in Slack groups too. I think that the good Slack groups, and that's another thing of COVID, right? Like Slack groups are just exploded on the scene. I would say, I'll use those as an example. Like keep the conversations going. No momentum is death for a community. So you have to keep the conversations interesting and lively, and I would say somewhat controversial too. Don't be afraid to call people out or debate, right? Like there's nothing more boring than like a consensus driven discussion where everyone agrees with each other. I hate those.
Yeah.
It's like you may as well just stop talking. It doesn't make any sense. So I'd say that's one way. Just get involved with that. I mean, obviously speaking at events too is another way you can help out with communities. Like,
I disagree, Joe. No, just kidding.
well,
I'm kidding.
Yeah, no. Some people might, but I think that speaking at community or types of events, I think is a really good way for you to also get exposure. As a somebody maybe wherever you are in your career, right? But because again, events need speakers. That's kind of how that is, and I would say just be a good ambassador for the community. Or just volunteer and see if people need help. I mean, any organizer needs help. If they don't, they're totally lying. So, and the number one thing too, again, is just like making sure that the community doesn't die of, just a slow death or fade into obscurity, because that tends to be what happens. I've had that happen to some groups I've had, but they just dwindle away. That's how it is if you don't pay attention to it. So,
yeah, I know. I love the idea of engagement, or like sometimes carrying a conversation a little bit. Those go so far. I mean, the way I've viewed communities is if you have like 4 or 5 people that are really engaged, they carry the weight of the remainder and encourage people to communicate further. And
right.
if something I've noticed in Discord communities or whatever it might be is that you really need to celebrate those people. You make them admins, you give them free stuff, you give them shout outs, make sure that they feel like they're valued in that community. This is from the other side if you're creating these communities, because they're going to be what makes or breaks your community. Is that if you can have that constant chatter that encourages other people. You also should be very involved in your own communities as well. That's something that I think is important, and I sometimes
it helps. I'm the same way, right? I mean, and it's easy to get spread thin with communities too. So yeah, it's just and that's the other thing too. I would say, for people too, it's like with social media, like maybe or channels or communities in general, like pick one or two. I think it's hard to be effective in a community if it's spread all over the place. There's a lot of cognitive dissonance, and I think it's hard to be effective. At least for me personally, that's why I only do YouTube and LinkedIn. But I also killed all my other social media on purpose. So people are getting too idiotic around the last year. So
I like was anti-social media, just YouTube and LinkedIn until like middle of this year. I guess we're kind of still middle of this year, but yeah. And I started with Twitter and I started with Instagram, and I silence all notifications on those. I don't really respond to anyone.
Smart.
I try to use them more for push than pull, because I'm bad at keeping my attention. And I'm working really hard to like own the social media rather than it own me.
Right.
But man,
Smart.
it's like a mental battle, which probably isn't great for my productivity. But at this point, I feel like I kind of have to be involved in those communities if I really want to make maximum impact, which is like a trade-off that I have to figure out if it's worth it, right?
Right. Just get a parlor or something. Joking. Well, nobody's on there anymore anyway. So audience, just don't get at me on that one.
Oh, exactly. So something that I found really interesting, and we talked a bit offline, is your rock climbing career. I really like to dive into, maybe too deeply into, some of the personal lives of the guests.
That's fine.
But can you just walk me through that? I think something that really, again, we talked about this offline, that's something that makes data scientists interesting is their hobbies and their intensity for these types of things.
Yeah. I mean, I grew up in a small town in Wyoming called it's Lander, Wyoming. So for people who climb, they know where it is. They know what it's about. It's one of the better climbing areas in the country. But it wasn't always the case. I mean, when I moved there when I was a kid, I was around 10. There wasn't any real climbing there. This is back in the 80s, and so, but it started picking up, and a lot of good climbers had moved there. Todd Skinner, who and Paul Piana, who are two of I think they're the first guys who actually free climbed El Cap back in the day. Not free solo, but climbed it with a rope, not hanging on hooks and stuff. So they did a first free ascent of El Cap, and then subsequently a lot of other hard mountains at the time, and that's inevitably I started getting involved in their circle when I was still a teenager, and got into climbing through those guys actually, and so that was kind of cool to I think have the mentorship of that community, because these are like some of the leading climbers in the world at the time, and serendipitously, me being just a punk teenage kid getting into climbing with these guys and their friends, and I was actually just speaking the other day with one of their sons, my friend Karn, it's Paul's kid. We're talking about climbing. I hadn't talked to this guy in like 25 years. That was cool catching up and just reflecting back on climbing. But it was back then. It was a sport that we were getting into bouldering at the time. I think we were probably the only people bouldering because we couldn't afford ropes, so we just went bouldering instead. But that was really cool. And now bouldering is and there's just it's an Olympic sport now,
yeah.
right? It's huge. Back then we didn't even have crash pads. I think we were just taking a slab to carpet out to fall onto and wipe our shoes on. But it was fun. And so I in the mid to late 90s, I mean, I was climbing a lot. Climbed with a lot of great climbers who are probably still climbing today, and some of them are very, very famous and stuff. But it was cool back then. I think it was because it was a very underground sport still. So it was a true dirtbag. Like dirtbag now, like van life's like the cool thing to do. Back then, it was like the thing you did because you just didn't have any money and you're like a social reject. So that was cool. So just being involved in that community, I think was awesome. And then I got sponsors along the way. I was pretty decent. It was in some magazines, and I ended up in Salt Lake City. I was out here for the Outdoor Retailer Show, visiting some sponsors, and ended up, I thought I'd be here for a few weeks and moved here, in 98. And I've been here ever since. So the climbing's fun. What I like about it is it's like really good problem solving. If you try and figure out a way to go up, a boulder or a route, for example, it's like, to me, that's it's mentally exhausting, but it's like chess almost. Like, how can you best execute moves in a way that you're not going to get too tired at the top or fall? So, yeah, I think it translates well to like data, for example, where you're trying to solve just gnarly problems, especially when you're talking about like first ascents of climbs where there's nobody who's ever done it before. Like trying to figure out, okay, so how are you going to do this? Where are the holds? Are there even holds? Right? Is this possible? And then I guess figuring it out, like that's to me is cool. And I still do that. I still climb. So all these years later, it's still a lot of fun.
I really liked quite a few things about that. I think that like looking at a scenario like it is a problem to solve is is like a fun thing that we do every day, and loving that process and like enjoying that mental drain is so fun. I also loved the concepts of mentorship and community that you were a part of. I mean, to me, from outside looking in, that's something that clearly helped you grow as a climber and enjoy that more. And I would also imagine that first day when you're out there with essentially these climbing legends, you weren't just like running up and being like, hey, tell me everything. It's one of these things where you're observing and you're around, and then you can start making these concepts when you have something to stick it to more. I think like we talked again offline how I'm starting to learn jujitsu.
Right.
And from my perspective, like some people go up and they ask the professor, hey, tell me everything. What should I know right on the first day? And you're not going to create a good relationship with that person because they're the expert. There's blue belts and purple belts and brown belts that might be able to give you more information like that. But once you have an understanding, once you've observed, once you have some substance, you can go in and really start to ask like well-informed questions of these people. And I think that that's something, at least for me, from I can't speak on your specific situation, that's been really valuable, is understanding like, okay, when are the right times to ask questions, especially if these people are more high
Yeah,
profile, or there is that, like, like the knowledge gap is so different.
it's an interesting one. I mean, 'cause, I do both sports, jujitsu and climb. There's some similarities, I would say, to the progression of the two. I would say climbing is a bit more open-ended in the sense where like no two climbs are the same, unless you're in a gym. But it's difficult. And so the things I realized is for climbing was really understanding the mental aspects of it, like getting over your fear of falling, right? And that only happens through just falling a lot, actually. Avoiding falling is actually the worst way to get over your fear of falling. Like you have to fall. They just understand like it's not that bad. And when you're climbing, after a bit, then it's like, if you fall, like no big deal. Depending how you fall and what you fall into, it might be a big deal actually. If you, I should probably retract that. Yeah, yeah. If you're at the top of El Capitan or open, you fall, it won't be good for you. You have a lot of time to think about it though on your way down. But yeah, I think it's interesting. I mean, I've always tried to surround myself with, I think, the world class people, or at least the best people I can find, regardless of what I get into, right? So, and I think that because it's not so much even asking questions, I would say, but just being around the presence of really good people forces you to adopt their patterns almost by osmosis, right? So it's like the old saying, like the average of the 5 people that you surround yourself with, or whatever, right? And so it's the same thing with mentorship and learning. Like I consciously try and seek out the best people I can find and learn from them. It doesn't do you any favors to learn from people who you'll probably be better than them in like a short order of time. Like maybe you are. Maybe if you're better than the best person in the world in short order of time, congratulations, right? That means you're
Merry
awesome
Christmas.
or something. Yeah, but that's probably not going to happen, right? Like, and so, but I just think that being around great people, like I know when I remember one winter I went to Waco Tanks, which is a climbing area in Texas, and I was climbing with like Fred Nicole, who was like literally the best climber in the world at the time, and living with him, and like that, and a bunch of other climbers like that. And I think that experience really forced me to understand, okay, like there's what I thought was difficult, and they're climbing out at such a different level. Like I can do this too. And so I think it erases a lot of the mental barriers you put in front of yourself as well. Like if you're around like the best people all the time, you have no choice and no option but you have options actually. You could probably just continue sucking, but if you're motivated, you're probably going to be inspired, and you're going to realize like they're no different than you. They just happen to maybe be a bit smarter about how they do their stuff, whatever it is. And the same with jits. When I was doing jits, I made it a point to surround myself with like really awesome people in the field. So I trained with like Eddie Edmonds in Salt Lake, who was Pedro Sauer's student. Pedro was like, I think, the guy who brought jiu-jitsu out of California and to the rest of the world, because they opened their second studio actually, like the Gracie's did here in Salt Lake, strangely enough. And so yeah, so it's a strength. Then when I was doing more kind of MMA type stuff, I was at Jeremy Horn's gym, and like he's like one of the most decorated fighters still of all time in MMA. And so that, but I think finding people like, and I could have went to people who were, maybe a bit cheaper, a bit, I would say less caliber, but it's like, if you're going to seek out knowledge and skills, like find like the best people in your area that you can find, or now in the world, because, especially with platforms like YouTube, I mean, you can find literally the best people on the planet that you can learn from. You may not interact with them, but, always seek out, push yourself really hard, right? And find the best people and put yourself in uncomfortable situations. So
I love that. I'm a huge fan of biographies. And you can condense someone's entire life where they've done incredibly great things into like 4 hours of reading. Right. To me, that's such an unbelievable thing. Or any books by these experts, is they've literally condensed their life's work into something that's digestible for you. Well, a lot of that, if they're like Michael Lewis, and they write a book, like an incredible book every year.
Yeah, he just spits out like amazing books. He's unreal. Yeah,
it blows my mind.
So crazy.
But yeah, I mean, it's one of those things where you can download this information in 1/100th the time that it took this person to accumulate that information. You might not understand the specific nuance of it, but like you're getting to probably 80% of their knowledge in 1/100th the time of these really excellent, great people. And that's the thing also, is if someone is really advanced in their field, if they are at the top, they're probably sharing if they're nice, they're probably sharing a lot of what they're doing, a lot of their information, their resources. I mean, not to say
Yep,
that I'm on the top of this field, but like even someone like myself, I share a lot of what I learned. I try
you
to share
do.
my experiences, and that's um, I put that out there for people to watch and learn from, not just because I'm like an egomaniac and I want to see my face all over the place, right?
You wear t-shirts with like your face on it and stuff. No, I mean it's true though. And it's the old Zig Ziglar saying, like, you get where you want by helping other people get where they want to go, right? And I think that's the golden rule of life. It's not treat others how you want to be treated. I think that that's part of it. But I think if you can help people, selflessly too, help people get to where they want to go, a lot of things follow. Like the fact that you're out there putting out great content, and I think inspiring that, the next generation of data scientists is that comes back to you, right? And in great ways. That's why I was like, oh, I'd love to talk with Ken because he's doing great stuff. Like if if you took the opposite, if you're like some, kind of like self-absorbed prick who just like didn't share anything, was just like, always like, oh yeah, well, if you want to talk to me, it's gonna be like $500, and like it's like $10 for an autograph, like that kind of guy. Like
You heard it, everyone. $10 for an autograph.
$10. He has a special though. Yeah,
$4.99.
Yeah, if you use a special coupon code. Yeah, so I mean, but there are people like that out there, right? And I don't think they get as far as they think they're going to go, just because there's a lot of options these days for great information, and I don't think gatekeeping is sort of the best way to go about it. So
yeah, I agree. I think for like content creators or people that are sharing in particular, there is also that there's this trade-off of, okay, like, I'd want to help as many people as possible, but we do that by sharing video or we share a blog post because that's scalable. Like you can help.
yeah.
I would love to respond to every email, to every message, to those types of things, but at the volume those are coming in, I wouldn't do anything else if I responded to all those messages. And I try to still respond to all the YouTube comments, but it's like, hey, I can control that niche, that can control that channel, but the other ones, it's just too much of a backlog. And
So everyone, after this video, please email Ken and send him messages on LinkedIn. He'll respond to them in due time. Thank you.
I will respond to all YouTube comments, and
Okay.
I will stick to that for as long as that is manageable. But the rest of it is a crapshoot.
Yeah, I totally get it. For that, I usually set aside, like, I always set aside 4 to 5 to respond to all emails and anything else, administrative stuff. Like, otherwise, it's too hard, right? It just eats at you, so it's hard.
It is what it is, though.
But it is what it is.
I would love to shift back a little bit more into the data engineering space.
Mhm.
I think that that's something, obviously, you have a lot of specialty and understanding about. And you also have some unique perspective into the entrepreneurial side of starting a company within that space. So what are some of the findings that you had that made you decide to want to create a company in this space? And what are some of the things that you've learned from working in this space?
Starting a company, I think I started a company because I'm practically unemployable. So I think that was the easiest answer to that. I can work at companies, but it has to be the right situation, I think. I don't know. I don't know about you, but I'm the personality. It's like I really like to I like to create. I like to innovate in my own little way. I think everyone does that. And I'm pretty restless too, right? So I think being bogged down by other people's bureaucracy is I don't know, I just got other things to do with my time.
Cut from the same cloth.
Yeah, right. So you get it. And I guess, if you're gonna be in a bureaucracy, you may as well just make your own, right? And then you have no one to blame but yourself. So that's kind of how I approach business. Plus I've always been entrepreneurial. I help pay for school. As I used to be actually a professional club DJ as well. So I have many different lives. As you can tell by my setup in the back, I still play.
We'll have you spin for us one time.
It'd be kind of fun. Yeah, but so I've always, I guess, been a bit of a hustler in that sense, where I've just kind of gone out and just done stuff. Like somebody the other day was like, "Wow, you kind of like treat the way you promote ternaries like how a club promoter would treat kind of how they do stuff." And I was like, "Actually, that's really a good point." It's very unorthodox in a lot of ways, right? But it works. And so, applied to data engineering, I would say, like, and how do we get into data engineering? Why didn't I start, a data science company or a Bitcoin company or a CBD company or something? I think like it's because I felt like data engineering was on the cusp of becoming something big. This was even back in 2016, even 2015. Because I've been doing a lot of data science work, and it's like, again, the hard problems I saw were all engineering related systems, helping data scientists be successful and that kind of thing. So after a bit, seeing this over and over, I'm like, well, I think companies aren't setting up the right foundation to succeed with data. And then I met my co-founder, and he was a data scientist, hired out of his PhD. He's a professor, and they poached him, and he had the same revelation. It's like I'm basically doing data engineering work, even though I was hired to do data science. And so we started this company with the mission of I guess helping companies set up solid data foundations through data architecture and data engineering. So and I think people thought we were crazy at the time. Like, why aren't you doing data science? Like, everyone's doing data science. Like, you guys are wasting your time. And I'm like, I don't think so. Not at all. So, and we've obviously grown and have a lot of great customers and partners. And I think they get it. And data engineering now is becoming obviously a its own thing. I would say anything you're looking at nowadays, like it's funny, you look at these LinkedIn polls, for example, of like, what career is going to be the biggest career in the next 3 to 5 years? And it's like either data engineering or ML engineering. Somebody will throw in some random career like, oh, I think like data storyteller is going to be the or something like that. I'm like, whatever, maybe it will be, but it's coming into its own as a field. It was probably, yeah, it's probably Ken. He's like, guys, data storytelling. But in all seriousness, I like the data storytellers too. Shout out to all my friends who do that and write books on it. So, but yeah, I just felt like it was right time. I tend to be maybe a bit earlier than a lot of people into everything I've been into. If you haven't caught that message by now, it's like climbing, fighting, music, and data and tech. Like, I tend to just be like, I think probably a few years earlier than a lot of people. And so maybe if you see, what's that?
Got to get into Zed Run.
Zed Run? What's that?
Oh, I'm like obsessed with this. It's people have probably heard me talk too much about it, but so it's online. Essentially, they replicated the horse racing economy in NFTs. It's like the first real practical use case of NFTs that I've seen that's like implementable. And so all the horses have like genotypes, they have different breeds. You can breed horses, you can race them. And it very closely, I mean, there's some things you can't consider, but it replicates the economy of actual racehorses. So you can go in and own racehorses and they appreciate if they do well. You can sell them, breed them, whatever it is. It's fascinating. I'm not going to go too far down that road.
Yeah, no, I made a note. I'm going to go check this out after. Like, that's the kind of stuff I like to go into left field and just go dive into. It just like, this like crazy stuff. So it's cool.
I've gone down so many rabbit holes.
It sounds like it.
But something I really liked about what you described is this kind of hustler mindset. I think that I see a lot of parallels between data science and entrepreneurship, right? I look at data science as like small scale entrepreneurship. Every project that we do, we're trying to solve a problem, very much like how an entrepreneur is trying to like solve a problem that we see in people's lives. It's just that, it's a very controlled and specific type of problem solving and entrepreneurship that we do within the data domain. And I think that a lot of those skills, a lot of that flexibility and thinking, a lot of that ability to pivot can pay tremendous dividends in the data domain as well. And a lot of the people that I've talked to, they kind of have that juice, the same sort of entrepreneurial juice, whether they're entrepreneurs or not. And that's something that I think is really fast. Maybe it's sampling bias, where a lot of the people that are more willing to talk on a podcast do have some of that entrepreneurial stuff coursing through their veins. But maybe
that's a really good point, though. I never thought of it that way. Yeah, but I think that there is, though. I mean, because it's just kind of like active exploring, right, and trying to figure out solutions where it may not be obvious. And that's identical to entrepreneurship for sure. Yeah, I totally agree. It's good insight.
I think that's something that really appealed to me in the career. Is I was in consulting before, and that's not that different. but you're working on
Right.
someone else's problems. I think in data science, you're still working on someone else's problem, but there's occasionally less constraints. That it's more of a free form. There's more creativity. You don't have a client breathing down your neck at every step of the way. Sometimes you do, but most clients don't know
Hopefully.
enough about the data science domain to be able to effectively critique you as much as possible.
Right.
One last thing I wanted to touch on. I know we've talked about you potentially writing a book over the course of this year and coming out next year. I'd love to hear more about that. When it does come out, I'd also love to give some away to
Sure.
some listeners here.
Yeah, so we're my business partner Matt and I were writing Matt Housley, that is. We're writing the fundamentals of data engineering, which is I believe it's O'Reilly's first data book or data engineering book. They've written a lot of data books. First data engineering book, and that is that's been fun. I think that the fun part about it is really understanding and thinking about the space, because I think I got some questions like, how do you write a book about a field that's changing in real time right now? I'm like, well, that's a fantastic question. So, peeling back like the immutables, what's not going to change, right? Like that's been a fun exercise, thinking about the data engineering lifecycle, thinking about the undercurrents of data engineering, thinking about things like, okay, so how would you describe architecture to somebody, right? All these things that might seem even easy end up being really difficult, actually. So I think it's been very, I read a lot, I write a lot, and I think a lot. And I do like the process of writing a book. I don't think this will be the last time I write one. I actually like this process. But yeah, first two chapters are actually under technical review right now. The whole slew of fantastic people. And, it should be up for early release, I think, as soon as the end of month. So on O'Reilly,
So
yeah.
exciting.
Yeah, then next, I think half the book is due, 15 days. So I got to get the rest of it done.
Get cranking. What are you doing here, man?
I'm kidding. No, it's fine. sorry, Nicole, my editor. Not playing hooky. But no, it's been fun, man. I mean, I always wanted to write a book, and I think I think the perfect timing. And I think, especially with data engineering sort of being on the cusp of something great. I think the timing of when this is going to be released, which is next year, is going to be it's going to be great timing. I think we're going to hit the wave just perfect, actually. Hope so.
I can't wait to read it, or at least skim through it.
Thanks. Yeah, we made it approachable though. We made it for actually data scientists, analysts, and software engineers. These are the people we actually find that are asking the most questions about data engineering, as well as data engineers themselves. But I think they have their own perspective on stuff. But I think it's really meant as a sort of a blueprint of how do you think about data engineering. It's not about tools, right? Because those change so often. It's more about what are the underlying principles that aren't going to go away, over the next several years. So
I love that. That's something that I personally strive to do in the content that I create. Is it's less focused on tools and more focused on what I believe to be like axioms almost within the domain. And that's one of the things that I find most difficult is like, okay, what story can I tell that won't be wrong in a couple of years, or even in a couple months? And I really admire that process, and that you really enjoy doing that, because sometimes it's the bane of my existence.
Depending on the day, it might be mine too. But it's just, you have to put it in a very inordinate amount of thinking into these types of things, right? When you're thinking about your content, for example, I'm guessing that it's not just like you turn on your camera and just start blurting out a bunch of stuff. Like there's a lot of thought. Maybe you do. Maybe
I script everything.
Yeah, exactly. It's and it's hard, right? Because I think you start writing and thinking about problems, and you're like, well, actually, there's a lot of other layers to this. Like you can't just be superficial about things, and so it's that's what I like most about this whole process, whether it's content creation or writing a book. It's just there's a lot of mental work that goes into it. I think it makes you stronger or dumber, one of the two, but maybe both. You're strong and dumb now. So
I love it. Those are all the questions I had, Joe.
Cool.
Do you have any parting words of advice, any final thoughts, any causes that you care about that you wanted to share, anything along those lines for the listeners?
Yeah, I would say just, it always, something I always think about is like that, the risky approach is usually the safe approach to a lot of things. Like I definitely think people should try and go out on a limb and do unconventional things and really just, I think you're going to make good strides in your career doing that, because you're going to places where not a lot of people are going. Obviously, don't do stupid things, but try and find ways that are related to your career. But yeah, I would say the data science right now, it's a growing field still, and there's just a lot of avenues you can take. And I would say the prescribed ways may not be the best ways for you. So and don't do drugs. I'm just kidding. So stay in school, all that kind of stuff. So
I love that advice before the school and the drugs ones about taking risk a little bit in your career. I think something that I've learned from interviewing candidates, something that I've learned from talking to so many people, is that the risk reward payoff is extremely imbalanced with taking some career risk. Like, what is the downside of taking career risk? Okay, maybe you lose 6 months of potential work in something that you would have cared about more. What is the upside? Is one, you potentially do something no one's done. You can make a lot of money,
right.
make a lot of difference, but you also have an incredible story to tell. People, when hiring, they love stories. Like, it's less about, oh, he did the same thing as everyone else. If you did something fundamentally different and you tried that, there is immense reverence for that in the hiring process or in communication or whatever it might be. Like, stories where you tried and failed, like, everyone knows when you try and fail, you learn something.
Yeah.
Like that's like one of the like common self-help or whatever it might be theories in the world. And when you embody that, people know and they appreciate it.
Yeah. And I was reading a really good article the other day from Morgan Housel. He's a writer, writes a lot about finance and stuff, but he had a really good article about tails you win. And it talked about basically like all the amazing things that have happened in the world are the result of like things that happen in the long tail of stuff. Right. So the improbable things, the unlikely things, like that's where all the major changes in the world have come from. It's not, by definition, it's not the
fat part of the normal distribution.
Yeah, exactly. Where everything's, where everyone's kind of centered, right? You don't get any changes or anything significant coming out of average by definition. And so, his whole thing is just like, try and shoot for the long tails, overweight those, because that's where all the cool stuff's going to happen. Nothing happens if you're just sitting there playing it safe. Obviously, like, try not to go bankrupt and like starve your family to death. But in this day and age, if you're decent at data, like, you'll find work. But I think it's also, find out what you want to do. There's a lot of cool stuff. So yeah, and and it's hard to get recognized in a field this glutted as well. There's a lot of, I would say, especially if you're starting out in data science, like, I'd rather interview somebody who's working on some interesting stuff versus like the 1,000 people that have done like the same Coursera class and have identical resumes. Like, you literally can't tell them apart. So there's nothing to talk about. Right. So
I agree.
It just is what it is.
So parting advice from Joe is chase those tails. Right.
Chase the tails. Chase your tail. Like, or my dog, she can chase her tail. So
awesome. Well, yeah. I really enjoyed this, Joe. Thank you so much for coming in.
Of course.
And I'm looking forward to chatting with you again soon.
Yeah, likewise.